Thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Dan Klein. I'm an information architect from Michigan. I'm curious, who is registered for the workshop tomorrow? Awesome. I'm going to do the best that I can to make very little of what I say tonight be redundant of that. And you'll be the facilitator tomorrow?
Yeah, we do have one spot that's free. If anyone can make it last minute, we had one cancellation. And the cancellation said that if anyone wants to sub in, I know it's hard to get like work off and stuff, but if anyone wants to take that spot, let me know.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So we'll have all kinds of modeling hands-on work tomorrow. So what this is, hopefully it's something a little bit short of a 30-minute infomercial for a workshop, and more just a conversation about the role of models in the making of digital products and services, and I bring an information architecture lens to that. Curious who here has people on your team, or are you yourself self-identifying as an information architect? Is that a role that some of us know about, others partially? Okay, so that's another thing that hopefully will become a little bit clearer tonight is talking about, well, what do we mean when we talk about information architecture? I have a point of view on that as well. Any objections before we get going, or questions about tonight? I can tell you a little bit about myself before we begin. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is the place that I'm from, which is pretty great to live in the place where you're from. I teach information architecture at the School of Information in Ann Arbor, which is on the other side of the state, and I co-own an information architecture consultancy called the Understanding Group. And so what I talk about comes both from an academic research standpoint as well as a practicing this every day, putting 12 people to work every day, bringing these ideas as services to clients all over the world. So if at any time it sounds like I'm talking about something that is bullshit, please call me on it. I'd love for this to be more of a conversation than a broadcast tonight. But most of what I talk about is that blend of research and practice. And most of my research as an information architect has been historical. I like this quote from Marshall McLuhan, who talked about looking at the present, but we're always doing that through the rear view mirror. That there are ideas from the past that, even when we're talking about the newest kinds of media and the newest kinds of ideas that we could learn from, and we're actually looking at that. Some of us from a rear view mirror. I have chosen for my rear view mirror this lovely old man, Richard Saul Wurman. Curious, anybody here familiar with this guy? Very few of us, one of us maybe. He invented the TED conference. Who here has heard about the TED conference? Okay, everyone. Much to Richard's frustration, the thing that we all know TED for, which is really highly produced, slick web videos, highly produced. When he started this conference in 1984 and ran it for 18 years, it was a very high stakes, risky kind of affair where none of the speakers were allowed to give a talk that they'd given before. And he took away the podium because he feels like that's a way to hide from the audience. So no podium, no slides most of the time. And he wanted it to be a collision between technology, entertainment, and design, where some of it would get on the audience. And oftentimes there were talks that didn't work. Richard sat on stage the whole time when he ran this conference. And if your talk was kind of going off the rails, he would get up out of his chair and stand behind you and maybe put his hand on your shoulder. That was how you knew it was time to be done. So he's given the world something that the world knows a lot about, but they know about it for the wrong reasons. And part of what I'm doing is, as Richard's biographer, is trying to tell this story in a way that makes sense. So the thing that I'm interested in him mostly for is as inventor of information architecture. And the way that he talks about information architecture doesn't always sound like digital products and services and UX design kinds of speak, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in it. Is it's a little bit different from the discourse in UX. In this piece of text here, this is from Inc. magazine in 1993. He said that information architecture isn't just graphics. It's about how to choose the right way to present information and how to help people navigate through it. It's a way of thinking. It's how you go about something in which the aim is not to make something look good, but to make it be good. And that's one of the reasons why he chose to call it architecture and not design, especially as somebody who was working in the 60s and 70s and 80s. He's had a 60 or so year long career. Design so often is thought of as being concerned with the aesthetic dimension and about how things look, and for sure that is essential to making things be good. But by making what it looks like equal to how it works, this point of view on information architecture has something to it that I've been studying now. Richard has been in my crosshairs research-wise for the last 8 or 9 years. One of the things that I've seen as I've looked at his work as an architect in the built environment is that architects and designers and planners back in the late 60s and early 70s worked in terms of models. And all of Richard's work, from the earliest to the latest, is a story about somebody trying to make the complex clear, always using maps and models as a way to figure that out. At the top in the slide here is a picture of a model of a bank in Philadelphia that his company, Murphy, Levy, Werman, designed. That's the bank owner there, sort of being shown what that particular conceptual approach entails. And at the bottom there is a cardboard model of a synagogue that was being thought of for downtown Philadelphia. And it's kind of hard to see in my picture, but it's on the grass. And this was for a congregation called Mikveh Israel. And Lou Kahn, the architect who taught Richard at Penn and whose office designed this, came up with this idea for towers to bring light into the synagogue. And so they built a cardboard model approximately of what this design would look like, and then put it outdoors in the sun, oriented it the way that this synagogue would be oriented to the compass, and then watched how the light changed in the model over the course of a day to not figure out how to build the building, but more to understand what would the nature of that space be in terms of light if they were to do it that way. So somebody who would go on to invent information architecture starts out working in the built environment. And if you were a built environment architect, when he was a built environment architect, maps and models, especially these really dumb physical cardboard models, was the way that you go about not how to build the building, but what should we make? What would be good to do? So when this model was being built in 1962, Richard was working for Lou Kahn, who was his idol, his mentor. I'm pretty sure that Richard has a little time of crying every day, thinking about Lou Kahn and missing him. He was a very powerful influence on Richard. He got to work on some of the biggest projects in the office, and then in 1962, Lou Kahn said he should move to North Carolina to take a teaching job at North Carolina State. And Richard still doesn't know why Lou did that. And anybody, so for me to try to understand Richard as the inventor of information architecture, I've had to do a lot of work to understand his mentor, Lou Kahn. And one thing about Lou Kahn was that he was always teaching. He always had as many teaching, he said yes to everything. Any sort of a lecture, any sort of a teaching opportunity, he always said yes to that. To the frustration of the people who worked in his office who wanted more of his time. And they would say, you got to stop teaching so much. We need you at the office to do this client work. And his reply to them at one point was, I will stop teaching as soon as the students learn more than I do in one of these classes that I teach. But it was essential to Lou's practice to have that balance between working for clients and trying his ideas out with students. And so a 27-year-old Richard, working arguably in the best architecture practice in the world at the time gets kicked out of the nest because this great opportunity to not just be an associate professor, but it was a full assistant professorship here at the university, and he stayed here for 3-ish years. I'm going to be digging around in the archive on Wednesday to figure out what were the precise dates, but he was here for at least 2 years. I think it's more like 3. So anyway, kicked out of the office, doing these great models, working on these great projects, comes to North Carolina, and one of the things that he did with his second-year architecture class was ended up building this amazing work of information architecture. I have one here. I have 2 of these. I have a number of these. I'm embarrassed to say how many of these I have. There are 1,500 of these made, and one of the finest examples of information architecture, and it's about models. So being ripped out of Lou Kahn's office, getting to work on models of buildings with Lou Kahn. One of the first things he does here in Raleigh as a teacher, for a month he had his students building models of 50 cities and towns, and all to the same scale. As a new university professor, he thought that he could have the library system, acquired maps of different cities in the world that he wanted his students to understand, and discovered that it didn't exist. You could not get maps of cities all to the same scale because cities define what is a border, what is industrial land. Even today, this is a huge problem of a baseline for defining cities in order to compare them to each other. So in just 4 weeks, he got his students making plasticine models with kindergarten clay, going to the library, finding out, establishing one scale for all of these models to be rendered at, and then turning the students loose with kindergarten clay and 17-inch by 17-inch boards to build these models of cities from all around the world, 50 different cities, rendering them all at the same scale. And what's amazing is, talk about kismet, the college had this loose leaf format that it already did its student publication in. And so he sized this so that you could get all sorts of different cities. Here's Manhattan. And then, I'll illustrate this on the slide also. So here's Manhattan. As some of you know, Manhattan was settled by the Dutch. It used to be called New Amsterdam. Here is a model at the same scale of Amsterdam. What this allows you to do, and after I'm done talking, you are welcome to play with this, and I have 2 copies of this that workshoppers can play with tomorrow. If you look at Canal Street in Manhattan, that's sort of the southern tip of Manhattan, and you think about the scale of those neighborhoods. Why does Lower Manhattan feel the way that it does? Maybe it had something to do with the people who were building it, recreating the kind of urban environment that they were accustomed to as the people who built Amsterdam. And what this allowed is, if you knew one of these places, here is the pyramid complex in Giza. How big are the pyramids? Well, I've been to New York. I've been to Washington Square Park. One pyramid is bigger than all of, like you can start, what he discovered, he talked about it as sort of backing into dog poop, this project of like, oh no, comparison. This could be, and he talks about how he had this realization, this could be my whole life. I just sort of stumbled into this, but if in 1962 we don't have maps of the world, of cities that are important, that are at the same scale, so that we've never compared these things. Not at the same scale, so we haven't understood them. And furthermore, if you knew where, let's see, if you knew Washington, D.C., if you knew any one of these 50 cities, so here's Washington, D.C. How does Washington, D.C. compare to Manhattan? Here's Rome. One of the favorite things that I discovered just naively by playing with this is when you look at a map of Rome and you look at the pyramids, How big is the Colosseum? How big is St. Peter's Square? The Colosseum and St. Peter's are almost identical in size. Is that the Catholic Church making a comment about the secular power structure that came before it? And then this Roman culture being influenced by the Egyptians, what is large-scale human space that is built for ceremonial purposes like the pyramids? Pyramids are pretty much the same size as the Colosseum. So this ability, in a really dumb way, I've been to some of these places, but not all of them. If any of his students knew one of these cities, they would have access to understanding 49 other cities. And what's fascinating to me, so this was a huge hit. It instantly sold out. Plates from this have shown up all over the world, and within a year or two of publishing this, Richard was going to be kind of famous as a protege of Lucan. When he was a student, some of his student work was featured in Progressive Architecture, which is a pretty big deal, or was at his time. But with this work of information architecture, he unlocked a whole modality for comparative cartography that registered, it made a difference all over the world. And so being able to think about what kind of a contribution, I'm sure he would hate to have his life talked about in these terms, but when you think about choosing what kind of an impact you can make, as an information architect, using this thing he just backed into, the power of comparison, that you can understand anything if you already understand a thing that is similar. This unlocked a whole world for him, and he ends up leaving architecture. His swan song in architecture was being chairman of the 1976 American Institute of Architects Conference in Philadelphia. He closed his architecture practice a couple months after that because they didn't have enough work, because he didn't know how to deal with clients, is his explanation for why his architecture practice was nearly bankrupt. But he knew, and I have this too, in my information architecture practice, we have a lot of downtime. I spend a lot of time making other things than the client work, and what he figured out is this thing he was doing in the downtime could be the thing. And an information architect doesn't need the permission of the client in order to build. And so from 1977 forward, Richard never really worked for anyone. If he did, he always got fired. And he made information architecture into a thing in the world. And if you wanted to summarize what is that thing, it's to not simplify information. So this publication was so popular that in 1974, he reprinted it in a codex book. And the simplification of this messy thing, I love looking at the contrast between these two modalities. It's the exact same information in these different modalities, and this is so much less of an artifact, of a teaching tool, of an artifact to unlock your understanding. And so it's not so much to simplify it like what this does, but just to make it clear. And that, in a nutshell, is his trick for information architecture. In 1989, he did a special issue of Design Quarterly called Hats, which was not about hats. And what he said there was the creative organization of information creates new information. So instead of simplifying or taking information away, his focus as an architect was on organizing it, structuring it in lots of different ways to figure out what are the most efficacious ways to organize. Same information, you organize it two different ways. What's possible to understand changes. In that same year, he published a second edition of a very popular book called Information Anxiety. It was translated into a lot of different languages. And in that book, there's the example of a data set of, he likes to make things as understandable as possible so we all understand dogs. The thought experiment here is if you took all of the dogs that are recognized by the AKC, it's something like 350, 360 some different breeds of dog. If you wanted to make this data set more valuable, what you do is you don't take the dogs away. You don't break it into subsets. You take that superset and then you put it through its paces. You find different ways of organizing the dogs, and that gives you different kinds of information. For example, if you organized all of the sporting breeds and compared them with one of the other categories, that would tell you something. If you looked at the males, because of sexual dimorphism, 10-cent word, with dogs, males and females being different sizes, if you compared the males and the females for the different breeds, that would tell you something. But his point would be, you don't know yet how valuable this data set is until you've put it through its paces, until you have worked with this complexity to find where the value is. And that's one of the things that I'm so excited about information architecture, and the opportunity to talk with people like you about it, is this idea that if we're simplifying, we are losing value. Anytime that there's an act of simplification going on, value is being bled out of the organization. So how do we keep the complexity, but still have something workable that we can all understand? Models. This is one of my sense is that information architectural ways of thinking and working are largely missing from how digital products and services are made today. And consequent to that, what we're missing out on is making maps and models, really big, dumb ones, at the earliest parts of processes. I like to joke when we look at our balance sheet for our business, and it's pretty depressing sometimes. It's like, we've got this great business where working with us always means we're going to add time and cost to the front of your project, and we might tell you that what you think you want to do, you shouldn't do. I think that's one of the reasons why we have not, information architecture is not a...
Need marketing help.
We do need marketing help, because if I say it like that, you don't want to buy it. But I think it's really important, and one of the ways that it brings value is allowing the organization to work with the complexity, to figure out with models, not with building software. Building software is a very expensive way to learn, but by building dumb models. So this is from somebody else from Penn, who was there at the time that Richard was, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. At the top is a duck. At the bottom is a decorated shed. When we use information architecture to deal with complexity, we can use models to figure out how do we want to deal with that complexity. This provides us, if we work in terms of models, with a range of what we could do. Before we're talking about how we're going to solve the problem, we can use really dumb models like these to figure out what is the range of possibility. On the one end of the range is the decorated shed. It's a neutral structure. We could look at the complexity of the product and service that we're working on and choose this to say, you know what, articulating a structure to deal with our complexity, that's going to be problematic. So let's embrace the neutrality of a very open structure. Just a box, and we'll put some stuff in it, and we'll put a sign out front that tells people what's in the box, and if it's a restaurant today, we'll say eat on the sign, and that'll be great. And then if we have to pivot into Frisbees, we can put a sign on the front that says Frisbees and fill it with Frisbees, and that would be great. And that we could choose this on purpose. A lot of times we get here through cowardice or through, we couldn't make the other good idea work. What I'm so excited about is being able to look at complexity in a product and service and say, this is the right structure for what we're trying to do, is a neutral structure, because reasons. The opposite of that, Denise Scott Brown coined this, is a duck. There's a duck-shaped building in Long Island that sells ducks. That's what this is modeled after. It's on Long Island. It's the Long Island duckling. And this is great if you sell ducks. The picture on the bottom is Lou Kahn's masterful library at the Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire. It would be really, really hard to make this not be a library. It is so library-y that you would need a wrecking ball to unlibrary that library. And when we think about a structure that is so bespoke, so if we sell ducks, I believe this is available to us in digital. We could choose this to articulate a structure for the thing that we're doing that is so tightly adapted to our concept that it couldn't be anything else. But again, sometimes either through somebody trying to be a mastermind, sort of the genius design approach, you get some things that end up being ducks. But again, could we choose this on purpose instead of getting there accidentally? That we have this range from neutral structure to a very, very bespoke structure. And my gosh, if we had the right kinds of models, we could make that choice on purpose. And we could, Christopher Alexander is another architect that I'm really interested in. He talks about how it's really hard to know what good architecture is and what good fit is. So he talks about, well, at least we can identify bad fit. And so the form, as far as he's concerned, is anything that we have the power to control and change. And the forces are all of the things in the environment that put demands on the form. His idea of what goodness in architecture would be a form that holds up, that stands up to the forces in the environment. We can use these really dumb, starting at the conceptual level of what kind of an environment are we working in? A very neutral environment where we're saying we could drop this structure from a helicopter and it would work anywhere. Versus the very bespoke structure that would only work in certain contexts. That's what this, working in terms of information architecture models, that's the promise as far as I'm concerned. And when I look at the digital products and services that are the most bad for us, Facebook, Outlook, some of these really terrible information products and services, my sense is that most of these are decorated sheds. That most of these have not been structured specifically to purpose. It's more that they just don't want to break anything as they keep adding features and maybe one day it's flat design and another day it's back to skeuomorphic design. But I think a lot of the structures in digital today, if we had to classify them on the decorated shed to duck range, I think a lot of these are more neutral than they need to be or could be, because it's so expensive to build the software to figure out if there's a different way of doing that would be any good. And what's missing is being able to work through these things in terms of models. So you could make that choice rather than just building a big neutral, a river down the middle and some shit on the left and some other shit on the right. Some of you have heard this definition of insanity, that doing the same thing all the time and expecting different results is insanity. This article from Nielsen Norman Group in 2016 is reflecting on 20 years at that point of enduring things that we do wrong. And if you look at that list, I think a lot of these problems are in the category of Peter Morville in Ambient Findability says, findability is everybody's job, so therefore it's nobody's job, and therefore that's why we can't have nice things. A lot of these, all of these, to my eye, are information architecture problems that could be figured out. What kind of a structure would be good to solve these things? Because we tend to only work in high fidelity, medium fidelity, artifacts that are about how you're going to build something, and not these really dumb models about what are the different ways we could approach it. These persistent problems, 20, 25 years on. What's missing? I think it's information architecture.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Are you holding all questions till the end?
No.
You mentioned Outlook and all these tools that are overwhelming. Are there any examples of good ones?
Craigslist.
Okay.
Anybody disagree?
No, it's just on there last week.
Isn't it?
And when you talk about what Richard said, not focused on looking good, but on being good, I've seen 1 million graphic designers do a fantasy visual rebranding of Craigslist, and those are all crap. They make it look more like this, and all of the reasons why, and Craigslist scales internationally. It's a beautiful information structure. So
Scales for the reason that you're talking about, though. It's like they personalize for the area. They have different policies depending on the city they're operating in.
Yeah, and a lot of this is, a big list. Each one of these could say, not clear, not clear, not clear, not clear, not clear. Craigslist is clear. It makes the complex clear. That's Richard Werman's gift to the world. Information architecture posited as, why is this a thing? Why is it good? Making the complex clear.
On this one, this slide too, is part of the problem though that you huge proliferation of tools, lots of unskilled people are creating lots of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, when the technological barriers come down, the kinds of problems that we already had when the technology was hard, we still didn't do this right. Now that the technology is a little bit easier, we do it even less right.
But isn't a big part also the level of abstraction that we're working at? So things like design or pattern libraries and things like that. And when I talk to junior designers, especially, they're like obsessed with fitting everything in their pattern library. They're like, what do you, in fact, I interviewed with a team recently, and a bunch of the members of the team that I would be managing were obsessed with patterns.
Yeah.
They're like, what's your opinion on implementing a design pattern? I'm like, well, is it appropriate every time? And I think the job, once you're using something like that and you're fitting everything into patterns, that's the opposite of differentiation. And at the OS level, they have these like really powerful patterns that, Android, iOS, Mac OS, Windows, they all have like these extreme levels of patterning that they put on applications that are being put in them, and like takes away creativity.
Orderliness is not order. And I think that this mania of design systems is because the clock is ticking and we're all being measured to deliver performance. And the sense is if we could get everything that's a problem somehow snapped into this design system, which is, does anybody here work in terms of design systems? Is that a thing where some of us work? Yeah, I'm hearing it all the time. And it's a mania to make it orderly, to put everything somewhere, and that isn't necessarily order.
Is it the sophistication of things like branding is going to be a more sophisticated department, or brand or graphic design is going to be a more sophisticated department generally in a big organization than UX, right? Their practice is older, it's more refined.
Yeah.
Standard. So they have standards. So shouldn't we as
Sure. Question.
I'm actually in the middle of a boot camp, and I'm finding the reliance on a lot of these prefab design systems like almost dogmatic. It's bristling me just because I was a freeform print designer for God knows how long, and it's a little bit like you're saying, like you're young people you're hiring. Well, that's the milieu in which they're saturating. It's a really weird time.
Well, I think it gets back to this. We want to do it good, right? And it's hard to know if you are doing it good. So being able to snap something into a design library, a pattern library, you've done it right because at least it's manifested with the same components that the other things are. But we all know, I think we've all used like Google Calendar in the browser, for example. The hamburger menu on the left doesn't have a menu under it. It just expands and collapses a left rail. That same hamburger, so even Google doesn't know how to, they want to apply the system to all the things, hit everything with a design pattern stick, but we're still not talking about making an architectural decision for what things are. It's more like, I have a set number of things, just map all of these to all of those, and then we'll be good, which doesn't work. So my thesis is that why we can't have nice things. Why does a young field like our field already have 20-plus-year-old worn-in patterns of doing it wrong? I think it's because we don't have the right maps and models. And I think it gets back to what I said earlier, which is I'm offering you information architecture as a process. It is festooned with maps and models, and this will add time and cost the front of your process, and by looking at these maps and models, probably we'll figure out that what we think we wanted isn't what we want. This is the canary in the coal mine. This is a really early way to figure out how we're going to deal with complexity, not by asking how we're going to solve problems, but just by iterating through with really dumb models. What could this be? Could we play out? Could we scenarioize? What could this be? And that is a really expensive process to do with high fidelity prototypes, with comps, with wireframes. What I'm talking about are models that are way dumber than all of the deliverables and things that we typically do in UX.
I have a question.
Sure.
So you talked about, it costs more, it takes more time. That's relative, right? So relative to what you get out of it, is there some part of what you do that does shrink the overall time and makes it?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, okay.
The overall, but again, we are measuring in 2 weeks. A lot of our stakeholders, a lot of the people who are signing off on project plans, who want to look at a project plan that looks kosher to them, they want to see it yielding an end state every 2 weeks, something that is part of the end state every 2 weeks. And what we're talking about here is maps and models that will help you find what you won't do, where there's going to be more models on the cutting room floor, and that feels like a loss of value to, organizations don't want to invest in going through 16 bad ideas to get to a 17th. They want to start with one idea, presume it's a good one, and then keep pushing that forward in a death march until we pivot or get our next round of funding.
So is there an example of a company that we might recognize that has gone through these processes besides Apple maybe?
Well, this is fairly foreign to Apple's way of working also. Famously, Steve Jobs needed 10 high-fidelity comps of the end state in interfaces of any new feature or functionality. He needed to see it 10 different ways in the fullest res, the most unmistakable from a real end state as possible. So no, I don't think... there are some examples of organizations like Vanguard has had a really mature UX capability for 20 years or so, and information architecture and these kinds of maps and models have been part of how they do work for a very long time. But no, short answer, I don't know who's doing this.
Vanguard, just by observation?
The group of people who share this set of obsessions is pretty small. And Andrew Hinton, who wrote a book for O'Reilly called Understanding Context, he was one of the early...
What's the book called?
Understanding Context.
Well, even Vanguard's even founded around the idea that they were clear about their financial principle. I mean, they have a different approach.
They have an ethical, they have a business model that is, our investors have maximum visibility to everything that we're doing, and they don't make commissions. So they've got nothing to hide. So it's organizations, my company, we've had the most success in selling this kind of approach to large-scale philanthropies like the Ford Foundation or the Kresge Foundation. People for whom meaning is important tend to need to work this way, but with the pressure of agile and always be shipping and living life in 2-week intervals, even when we talk to people about a sprint 0 to get more maps and models into the environment, it's like, yeah, that'd be nice. We all know it would be nice, but to invest, again, 4 or 5 weeks more in the front of a process to get an accurate... there's also the zones of pragmatic deceit. In the absence of maps and models, there's a lot of shit happening that isn't cool that the organization would have to deal with if it knew. And so we don't want to make accurate maps and models. We don't want to... Another thing that Richard said that I love is the pervasive seduction to designers is to provide a solution instead of telling the truth. And to work in terms of the maps and models that I'm going to teach some of you to use tomorrow. This is dangerous stuff. People will lose their jobs sometimes when the organization sees a truthful model of what it is. Oftentimes, these kinds of maps and models, when we show them to the clients, it's like scales coming off of their eyes. We're showing them what they've always seen, but because it's bigger and dumber and earlier and doesn't look like interfaces yet, they're like, oh, this is why. Like some of these maps and models, we've had pieces of paper as wide as this room, and clients walking around on this map saying, oh, this is why returns always disappear. It's because this should be connected to this way over here. And who wants to take the time to build a visualization that you can't use on a screen? That thing we rolled out that was literally the width of this room, the PDF of that was useless. You post that PDF to Basecamp, what's anybody going to do with that? I don't care how big your cinema display is. I don't care how big your Jumbotron is. Some of our clients have these 79-inch flat screens now. That model is too big for any screen. It needs to be a piece of paper on the ground. And there's something about the physical act of this is 7 steps too far from where it's supposed to be. When we work with maps and models of the type I'm describing, people will see what they've always seen, but never seen. And when I say maps and models, it's the same thing. Spoiler alert, at least according to Dave Gray, there was an interesting thread on Medium and on Twitter about what's the difference between a map and a model. They're basically the same thing. Models are dynamic, let's say, where a map is maybe a snapshot of a model. Marcia Haverty and I sort of talked with Dave about this. I said maps indicate relationships, models prescribe and predict relationships, and then Marcia said that and models show something of the mechanics underlying the relationship dynamics, maps that move. At the Esri user conference last week in San Diego, they were talking about self-healing maps, and that is a scary concept to me, and I think that starts to really coalesce with artificially intelligent systems. Once there's maps and models that are talking to each other that can build themselves, that'll really be something. But maps, models, the point is we need more of them. And if anybody gets hung up and says, your model, that's kind of like it's a map. Just let them right off that hook. It's a map, it's a model. It's something we're using to make the complex clear. And the high abstraction ones, these are the ones that are the most useful to information architecture. And because of the high level of abstraction, they're the ones that seem like we can skip them. But the purpose of abstraction, I think this is that seam between what nice things are and why we don't have those. We're missing this high abstraction stuff, and this quote from Dijkstra, the purpose of abstraction is not to be vague, but to create a new semantic level in which one can be absolutely precise. There are aspects of the product and service that we can only really dial in at this really dumb model level. We can be more precise. Counterintuitively, the more abstract we get with these models, we can dial into a better level of precision oftentimes. So it's a question of what is the right level of abstraction. And interactions and interfaces are medium to low abstraction. Or another way of saying that is this is the higher fidelity stuff that we tend to focus on in UX design and software development. User models, that spans the whole range. And if the org does have some experience working in high abstraction models, maybe it's in terms of user segments or personas that are at a very diffuse level. But more often than not, we're not getting to this level of precision because we're not working at an abstract enough level, is my argument. The more abstract, the place where working in terms of information architecture gets really interesting is in terms of business model, ecosystem models, overall system maps and models, and structural models. And again, none of this is site maps and interfaces yet. These are more abstract than that. So I'd like to demonstrate some of these kinds of really dumb models. And when you say dumb models, at least, I think of, has anybody here seen the movie Zoolander? Anybody know what the joke is? I really do think that this applies to UX and software development. If we do use models, who here has seen the Zoolander movie? Hands up. Most of us, so for the two of us who didn't see it, there's this really dumb model whose name is Derek Zoolander, and he has paid a designer to design the Derek Zoolander School for kids who can't read good. And want to do other good stuff too. It's got a plaque. When the model is unveiled, and there's literally an unveiling of there's a canvas thing over this model. He gets down and he looks at it, and then he throws it on the ground. He smashes it, and he says, "How can the children be expected? How are we supposed to teach students to read if they can't even fit inside the building?" And he's such a fool that it seems like a silly, but I don't think this is silly. I think this is literally what happens to us. Is there's a high fidelity. The reason he was tricked. The model was it was such a picture of the literal end state, down to finishes of metal and wood and things like that he's a fool and he was tricked. I wonder if when we're working through wireframes and prototypes with our clients, they think that they're looking at part of the end state. And oftentimes the way that we use these models, they are. We're looking at different levels of fidelity of an end state. The kinds of models that we need are not yet a picture of an end state. This is a pictorial model. Derek was supposed to get excited about this building project that his foundation was funding because this showed what it looks like. What I'm talking about are models that are making an argument for the way something could be put together. And this goes back to not unlike the models that I showed you from Lou Kahn's office and from Richard Saul Werman's work back in the 60s and 70s. You would never mistake the loofah sponge on a toothpick for a tree. This is at the level of fidelity where you can start to understand why it would be put together this way. This isn't giving you instructions for how you're going to build anything. This is an argument for the way that something could be put together. And I think the equivalent of this is what we need more of in our work in UX and in software development. I think this zone here, business models, ecosystem models, system models, structural designs, they need to be making arguments for what we're going to do, not be prescribing how we're going to do something. And one example of this is a really quick, dumb example, but I'll just walk you through this. This is from my friend Jason Hobbs. That we could establish the truth with the product team, with the project participants, with the stakeholder, by building these very simple models, maybe just circles and lines. So this seems like kindergarten or pre-kindergarten basic, but I'm pretty sure there are organizations for whom if we posited this as a model, that this would be so controversial that the project couldn't even continue. The zone of pragmatic deceit about what are we working on. If we're working on something that has two parts, I do a lot of work for universities, colleges and divisions inside of universities. They don't, if this is the architecture school and the planning school, in the college, and this is a project I'm working on right now actually, the Taubman College at the University of Michigan is a design college that has urban planning and architecture. There are some participants in that meeting who, if we just establish that these are equally important, we would have to stop. And that would probably be really good for the project. Because if we can't establish this, I mean, this is a clear picture of what is the truth. That's what these rhetorical models, if we can just get people to agree on what we're talking about, that these are equal in importance. That this is directly connected, equal in importance and magnitude to that. Oh gosh, we're cooking now. We're really saying stuff about what is true about the world, and that is a prerequisite to making good structure. And we can keep going. And these models can be incredibly precise. We can count the number of things. So if we were talking about a digital ecosystem, we could measure the sizes of these circles. We could use Google Analytics to measure, let's say, the use of these two products, and make sure that when we size them, that is a factually correct representation of really complex statistical proof of what's true about the world. And maybe we could say that now it's not approximately, that's exactly 5 times the size of the other one, but they are still directly related. This could pop one of those bubbles of pragmatic deceit. Everything in the middle one is circumscribed, encompassed entirely by the one around it. There's no aspect of what the middle part does that isn't completely circumscribed by what the thing around it is. That could be a truth that the organization is not conversant with, that it does not yet understand or is not yet willing to accept. That could help us design the right thing. This is not at the center. It's tending toward one side of this. If we've got products and services, and if we were to put some labels on here, and the service side is on the left, and this is more about the products. I think these models are incredibly important. I couldn't draw this one without quickly doing that as a Star Wars person. This shares something with that, but not most things. There's a whole world of this that doesn't get touched by the other one. And then you can get to something like this. This is a piece of client-facing work, the result of several weeks of stakeholder research, site audit work, to come to this semantic level in which we can be absolutely precise. Is this the world that we are working on? And the voice of the business and the different units being able to say, we have products, almost all of them are mapped to a designer. But some of them aren't. Some of them will be anonymous, like our keyboard trays or our monitor arms. We don't have famous designers who design those, but most of our products are designed by. Some of the ways that we talk about these products are in terms of solutions. All of the solutions that we talk about are in terms of these designed products. So when we talk about solutions, you're never going to misfile the monitor arms and the keyboard trays in solutions. You shouldn't be able to get to there because we had this model. We agreed that what's going on here is that solutions are in this designed by world. Some of our solutions are sold in the store, but not all of them. Some of what people access in the store is connected to research, but most of it isn't. So we're going to have a shopping experience that isn't super nerdy. And if this conceptual model, in Grand Rapids we have a lot of the big furniture companies. If this were a conceptual model for Steelcase, that research circle would be wrong. Steelcase goes to market on the basis of all of these products are researched. We understand the human performance of everything that we sell. Before getting to work, being able to establish, and especially as a consultant, I don't get to move in as much as I'd like to. I don't get to stay. I haven't been there long. So by getting to something like this pretty quickly, like after 2 weeks, I can render something like this, and if we can agree on this, then we're cooking. Then we know what the truth is, and then I can start to draw a picture of something different than, if this is the current state, then I can start changing the size, the adjacencies of these circles, and start making a different argument about what we should do. And unlock that power of comparison before and after. We did this kind of modeling in terms of an audience for a big manufacturer, one of those furniture companies. We said if we, and this is, again, you get out the calipers, this is reconciled to Google Analytics for the measurement period that we were working on. This is how much content there is for these 4 really big audience buckets today. And this is the future state. Relatively speaking, So we not only know that there are going to be more specific adjacencies, like where they touch is not so much dictated by this current state model. We're saying not only are we going to grow content types and audience focus on content in these ways, but we're going to be more purposeful about the places that they touch. Amazing amounts of agreement, durable agreement among people who don't always agree, because we're talking about 4 things. But they're the right things, and we've brought the rigor of measurement to this without rubbing the client's nose in it. We can make a much more sophisticated picture with graphs and traffic visualizations and stuff. But what we're trying to do is agree on what's going on here, what's the truth, what's the baseline information we want to respond to as architects and designers.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, you're showing a lot of these models, they're extremely intuitive. I feel, so I worked in different modes for a long time, a lot of forecasting, and overwhelmingly confused in a lot of cases, and I've had to do this sort of thing. Not as sophisticated, but this picture is sometimes glasses on tables.
Yep.
So I don't understand, so I struggle a lot, I've had a lot of conflicts in my work over this with management times. I don't understand how you can go forward and not have something like this. Like, I don't understand how your companies can engage you and walk away and say, we'll just accept the confusion, and are they paralyzed? I mean, how do you?
No, they have backlogs.
So they just keep going?
They can solve problems all day long. There's no shortage of problems to solve. You can be working on stuff. You can keep working on stuff. But when it comes to some sort of making a choice to make a different structure, that's why I love doing information architecture work, is almost always what we're doing is we're making a map or a model, trying to tell the truth about the real world, usually identifying some zones of pragmatic deceit that then are dissipated, and we're talking about the truth and people like that. And then we can posit a different shape to this. Give us your, so another one of the models that we use that I'll teach tomorrow is called an intention model. Do you want to optimize the website for quick hits? Yes. Do you want to optimize the website for deep sessions? Yes. How do you deal with seemingly pick one? What this model does is it takes out either or from the teeter-totter here, and in the middle is instead the word yet. And in green, so there were, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There are 15 stakeholders who we worked with, and we came up with these tensions. We listened to them, we did observation. We figured out what are these key tensions in the business, and I'll teach some of you tomorrow how to identify what these tensions are. And then we had them vote. And these spark lines, these chiclets, show the shape of the votes from the stakeholder team. So we asked them to analyze, how do you do this today? If this is a legitimate tension, how do you balance it today? And we had somebody way over here who said, we lean more toward optimizing for deep sessions. But most people were over there saying, no, the way that we do it today is we optimize for these quick hits. And then after we went through and had all the stakeholders vote on these things and look at how their intent is distributed, this one says who we're good at attracting today, who we want to attract. They're saying, yeah, mostly we're way toward, we shoot the fish in the barrel. And then we had them vote on what should the future state? How in the future should we balance these key tensions? And that's what this model starts to do, is it measures the gap to close between how we do something today, get in the funnel. We absolutely design web experiences for people that are all about getting them to a transaction. And at the same time, we want folks to be able to choose between many experiences. We don't want you to get into the funnel so close that you miss out on the upsell, cross-sell. There's maybe a better solution that you could have bought. We built a model of the organization, how it thinks it did these things in the past, in the green, and then gave them the ability to project forward and say, how should we balance this in the future? And we were then able to pair a model like this with a model like this to say, this is how you do it today. And then we can posit a solution that is, if we're really saying we are going to close 6 positions on this 10-position continuum from who we're good at attracting to who we want to attract, our aspirational audience target, this is giving the design team a whole lot of permission to change things in order to get to a different result in the future. So we combine models. This tells us what the stakeholders want and how big the gaps are to close. Sometimes before this, sometimes after it, we'll do an object model of what are all the things in the world. And tomorrow, some of you will be building one of these. This is a object model of a movie theater business. Let's see. A guest has an order that goes through a point of sale. A point of sale can be back office, kiosk, box office, app, website. All the points of sales take a transaction. Transactions sometimes are connected to rewards if they're a member of our loyalty program. And today, transactions only have tickets or concessions. And the fulfillment of concessions happens either by a restaurant or a bar or the concession stand. Tickets can only be for show times. The show time has rules, it has a movie, it has a room. The room has certain equipment, the room has certain rules. Some of the equipment in the room includes the seats, are they recliners or not? What kind of, is it 2D, 3D, 70 millimeter? So after or before we make a model like this, it's also really helpful just to get what are the things? And what are their most basic relationships? And is this true? Because then when we start to posit a different structural design, this is a different way of putting the movie website together. What we'll be doing is referring back to, well, this is what you said you wanted. This is how the information is structured in the world today. If you want, this starts to look like a sitemap. This is about as close to an interface as we get in this early modeling phase. If you want this kind of way of putting the parts together, then we know about some changes to this object model that we'll have to make. And if you want to do this kind of a website experience, then shopping and buying those interaction flows are going to have to be understood. And in all of this modeling, the language is a line that means something, a connector that means something that sometimes has annotation, about as dumb as it can get. Everybody needs to, when we do this kind of work, we don't let you leave the room unless you understand what these things are saying. And we will walk you over to the part of the world that you are responsible for and take you through it step by step if we have to. It has to be kindergarten, then it has to be kindergarten. We have to get down to what are the things, what are the rules, why might we choose to structure it this way? And then, my gosh, once you have all these models and you make them all agree with each other, then you can forecast, you can see the consequences of these kinds of design decisions and choose to refactor the models when you find problems. And ideally, as the development process goes forward, whenever we make a change to what are the things, labels, relationships, what is the interaction flow, what are the main categories and sections of the site, and what the client wants. Each week there's an opportunity for changes to any of those models. And our fantasy, we haven't enacted it fully yet, is to be engaged not just at the making of these models time, which we do, and I feel like we're really good at it, but to be kept around to help the organization institutionalize these models, to make updates to them as things change, and to make this be governance. So somebody's not going to go and change the structure of the website just because they had a discrete instruction from a CTO or a CIO. Once you have a dumb model that describes most of the world, then when anybody changes the world, it's pretty dumb and easy to update the models. And again, the fantasy is we haven't quite got here yet with all of our customers. that these models aren't just one and done, but they're an accurate picture of the world. And as we keep building the world, we can refactor the models to be a truthful reflection of that.
Yeah, that was awesome. So that we're at time.
Yep. Last slide.
Oh yeah, go for it.
This is the basic pitch for what I'm talking about, is that you could see it different. What a marvelous opportunity to see what you've always seen, but in a different way. And for those of you who are subjected to what we do tomorrow, you will be trained in how to do this. Questions? Objections?